So what we're going to do now is create a root store that can accommodate all of our stores that we're going to create in this application. And this will also give us a pathway so that we can access other stores from another store. Now that wouldn't be typical, and it's not something that we'll do a lot in this application, because ideally we want these individual stores to just be responsible for one specific part of our application, but there will be occasions where it's useful to be able to access observables or properties from another store. And what we'll do is we'll change what we're doing here. We'll make our export consistent from our activity store. So we're going to export our default class just the same way we're doing in our user store. So I'll remove this export at the bottom, and this is going to break our application, which we will be refactoring in this lesson anyway. And I'm just going to come up to the top, and I'm just going to say export default class and activity store. And what we'll do is we'll create, in our stores folder, we'll create a new file, and we'll call this rootstore.ts. And what we'll do in this case, we'll export a class of root store, and inside here we're going to add our individual stores as class properties. So we'll have an activity store, which is going to be of type activity store, and sadly that's not going to import automatically. So I'll just come up to the top and I'll just import our activity store from, and I'll go up to the activity store, and we'll also do the same for our user store here as well. So I'll say user store and user store, and once again I'm going to need to import this manually as well. So I'll say import user store from, and just go to our user store here. And then what we want to do is we want to pass in our root store as a parameter to a constructor when we create our activity store instance. So we'll give our root store a constructor, and what we'll do inside our root store is we'll initialize both of these stores, and we'll also pass in our root store as a parameter to our new instances of these stores. So let's see how this is going to work. So I'll add a constructor, and what we'll do is we'll say this activity store is equal to a new activity store, and what we'll do to pass in the root store is we'll just specify lists, which represents our root store. And we get an error here because our activity store doesn't have a constructor that accepts a parameter at this point, but we'll create that very shortly. And we'll also say list.userStore equals new, and we'll say user store, and again we'll pass in lists. And then what we'll do below the class is we'll export a const called root store context, and what we'll do here is we'll create a context and make sure we bring this in from React, and we'll pass in our new root store. So what we'll have inside our context now is a new root store that has our activity store and our user store accessible inside it. And then what we'll need to do is make our root store available within our two individual stores as well. So let's go to our activity store. And what we'll do just at the top here is we'll add a class property called root store, and this is going to be a type of root store. And again, this isn't going to import automatically, so I'm just going to import manually the root store, which is a named export in our root store file, and we'll just go up and specify root store here. And then what we'll do, we'll add a constructor for this, and we'll pass in our root store, which is of type root store, and we'll say list.rootStore equals root store. So when we create this particular activity store, or a new instance of this activity store, which we are doing inside the root store, we're creating this new activity store, we're then passing in our root store instance into this constructor. So what this means is we'll be able to access our root store via our activity store. And we'll also do the same thing for our user store as well. And in fact, I'm just going to copy this because it's going to be identical. and I'll just paste this into our user store as well, and let's see if the magic happens. And it does. Amazing. And what this means is that if I needed within a method or an action to access a property inside, let's say, my activity store from the user store, then what I could do is say list.rootstore.activitystore. And then I've got access to all of the different methods and properties and observables and actions, I should say, from within our activity store inside our root store. Now, we don't need to use that now, but we might do later. So what this does mean as well, though, is that our application is currently going to be broken. And if we go and take a look, then what we'll find is that this doesn't look quite right because we've just corrected that. So I'm just going to take a look at the root store, and this all looks fine. And let me just go back and refresh the page, see if that makes any difference. And no, it hasn't. But this error is not a legitimate error because we're not seeing it inside VS Code. It looks like our compiler has just got stuck on this particular occasion. So I'm just going to give it a kick. And when I say I'm going to give it a kick, I'm going to restart my application. So I'm just going to stop the application and restart. And this should move us on to a different, more accurate error about what the actual problem is. Because we will have some problems to fix. And that's a bit more like it because this is more accurate. Anywhere we're using our use context and trying to get our activity store, this doesn't exist in our context anymore. So that's why we get this particular error. And what I'm going to do, because we've used this in several different places inside our application, is we're going to need to refactor this to use our root store context instead of our activity store. So I'm just going to copy this line into my clipboard. And what we want to do is search for every occasion that we've used this inside our application. So I'm just going to go back to VS Code and let's go to our source folder. I'm just going to right click and say find in folder. And I'm just going to paste in the use context with brackets activity store. And this gives us the locations of everywhere we've used this particular use context method. So I'm just going to click on this first one. And what we want to do here is instead of using the use context activity store, we're actually just going to go and get our root store instance here. And instead of activity store, what we want is the root store context. So let's bring this in. And what we'll do is instead of using rootstore.activitystore.loadActivities, we'll just destructure the properties we need from the activity store inside here. So I'll say const and just open some brackets and say rootstore.activitystore, and what we'll do is we'll just bring in our load activities and our loading initial in here as well, and then I can just remove the activity store. From there, I'll still need to specify a dependency because we're still using the load activities method, so I'm going to change that to load activities, and we can also remove the activity store.loading initial from here as well. And that's corrected this particular problem. And we can also remove the activity store from the imports here as well. And let's go and take a look at the next one, which is in our activity list. And we'll just do the same thing again. We'll just swap the activity store for root store. And inside our use context, we'll specify root store context. And then what we'll do is we'll just add root store dot activity store here as well. And this should resolve all of the problems inside here. And we'll do the same for activity details as well. We'll swap activity store for root store, and in the use context we'll say root store context, and then we can say root store dot activity store here, and this will resolve the problems inside here. And one more to go just for our activity form. We'll swap this for root store, and we'll say use context root store context, and we'll say root store dot activity store. And what this should do is resolve all of our issues inside our application, and we should be able to go back and see various things, although of course we're still not sending up our token to our server, so it's not going to let us have our activities at this stage. But our stores are now working again. So what we've got now is the ability to use our stores anywhere in our application, and that goes for our activity store as well as our user store. And what we'll take a look at next is creating the login form so that our users can actually log into our application.